A lot of people have a perception of off the plan, a lot of fear with off the plan. What does it mean? What are the uncertainties? Is it dangerous? Is it for me? This morning's talk from me is going to relate to simply one aspect, and that is the legalities and the consideration that you should consider if you ever venture into an off-the-plan acquisition. Now, there are attractions, there are positives, and there are obviously some considerations that you've got to be aware of. Disclaimer, I'm not a research marketer, I'm not a salesperson, I'm not an off-the-plan advisor. I'm strictly a licensed conveyancer who does a lot of off-the-plan work on a regular basis, and over the years, investing myself individually and in dealing with other clients that have invested off the plan, I've been able to put together just a small list of considerations for you to think about when venturing into off the plan. If you were to compare an off the plan acquisition to a registered acquisition or a property that's already established, there are key components that you'll find that are quite different. And this is where the element of fear comes up. A lot of people turn around and say, well, what securities do I have? What's the issue with certainty and time frame? So I want to touch on a couple of points with you guys today. The first thing is time. When you buy your own home, you've got a definitive time frame of when settlement or completion is going to take place. 6-week period, 10-week period, 20-week period, whatever that period may be. It's a definitive time frame. When you're working with off-the-plan acquisitions, that time frame is quite uncertain. And it's only an estimated time frame that the particular developer can project to you of when they expect the project to be completed. And that is something that you need to take into consideration when making an off-the-plan acquisition. How long will the project take? When is the expected period of time that I should expect the project to be completed by? And most importantly, what happens if there are any delays? Now, a developer may project to you a 24-month build period, but they can't guarantee that time for many certain reasons that come up along the way that could delay construction. For example, bad weather. The developer can't control rain, storm, flooding, any type of inundation. So if there's excessive rain or excessive storms along the way, that's going to affect the time frame that the developer's projected. Another thing you've got to consider is approvals and permits throughout the year or throughout the course of construction. If the local council or other authorities are delayed in issuing various permits or approvals, that's going to delay construction for the developer as well. What if the developer is building multiple projects? What if they're depending on 1 or 2 projects to complete in order to finish the current project that you're about to invest in? And they may face some delays or some setbacks with these projects, which of course will have a domino effect on construction. So again, they may face certain delays. What about unions? What happens if someone hurts himself on site? What if we have an injury or perhaps a death on the site? What if there's an issue to do with wages and contractors wanting more wages? So there are many factors that are external to the developer perhaps that could individually or collectively delay construction. Now, what does that mean to you? It basically means a number of things. Number one, you've got to be prepared for potential delays. And more often than not with off the plan, you will face certain delays along the way of construction, along the course of construction. Whether it's positive or negative, that's for you to decide. I'm an off-the-plan investor myself, and I absolutely love delays. I'll give you my personal opinion. That's the disclaimer. It's my opinion. With off-the-plan, I'm buying a property where my money is going into a solicitor's trust account, and we'll discuss that in a moment. The price on the contract doesn't change. It's a fixed price contract. And the most important attraction for me as an investor is I have no holding costs. What does that mean? Until such time that completion of that apartment or that villa or that townhouse is done, I don't have to draw down a mortgage, and therefore there's no ongoing interest repayments on my mortgage. But the second important thing is I don't have any holding costs associated with rates and taxes on the land. Until completion takes place, there is no council, there's no water, there's no strata, there's no managing agent's fees, there's no comm, or any other expense that you would have on an ongoing property that you own. So in essence, perhaps the potential delay is not as bad as we may think it is when we're buying for investment purposes. Because we may have an asset that is appreciating in value. At the same time, our money is sitting in trust, and most often than not, it's invested in our interest, and it's not costing us a cent to hold during that period of time. Now, there is an argument against that. There's always an argument to every positive. And that argument could be, well, that's great, Pete, but what about my tax depreciation? What about my negative gearing? What about return that I'm going to get from when that property settles? And that is a very valid point, because obviously you can't claim any of these benefits until the property settles and starts incurring some sort of a return. And I guess what you have to do as a consumer is weigh the two together and think perhaps a free appreciating asset may be a little bit better leverage than an offset against negative gearing at some point in time. At the end of the day, negative gearing is negative gearing, in as attractive as it may be. So have a think about time delays when considering off the plan. Have a think of how that affects you as a consumer. Are you buying the property to live in, or are you buying as an investor? And think about potential delays along the way. One more point on time. A lot of people think, what if the developer purposely delays? What happens if the developer decides, I'll just delay for another year or two? We have to think about that again from a commercial perspective. Unlike us, the developer may have some substantial holding costs. So the developer may have, in fact, construction finance, or they may have finance on the land, or both. So it may not be quite lucrative for a developer to delay, because what do we have? We've got a fixed price contract. If you bought that property for $500,000, you're going to settle 2 years from today, you're still paying $500,000. If that market is appreciated, the developer is not going to get a cent more. That appreciation goes to you. So for a developer, it may not necessarily be commercially beneficial for them to delay construction. They've got to pay the cost of holding the site. They've got to continue to pay the taxes, the council, water supply if any. They've got to continue to pay the tradies, the contractors and subcontractors. So the view that a developer may intentionally delay construction or delay settlement of construction because of a commercial gain is a very, very thin argument. Something to consider. So the first thing is time. The biggest thing, the biggest question, the biggest concern with off-the-plan acquisition: how safe is my deposit? How secure am I? And media today and experiences that we hear from family and friends and other people, and highlights on Today Tonight and other stations that talk about people losing their deposits, has put a massive fear in people venturing into off-the-plan acquisitions. So we have to ask the question, what happens if the developer goes broke? What happens if the developer goes into bankruptcy? What if the developer doesn't finish the site? What if the site falls over? How safe is my investment? And at that point in time, you've got two investments in this project. Number one, your money, your deposit, which usually is 10%. But what do you think your second investment is as well? Anyone guess? It's a commodity. Which is? Emotional. What about your time? Yeah? Time. The first thing with off the plan now, this is very, very important. Your deposit is to sit in the developer's conveyancer's trust account. And you need to make sure that whoever is representing you has strict policy that when they are representing a purchaser with off the plan, that the deposit that you pay to that developer is never, under any circumstance, released to the developer to use for construction, for payment of wages, for acquiring material, or any other purpose under the sun. Your money is to sit in trust. Now why? And why is that important? Because if the developer does go into unfortunate circumstances and they are liquidated, if the developer does go into bankruptcy or something happens to the site, your money sitting in trust is 100% protected against the developer and also against the developer's creditors. So the developer cannot touch your money, and if they go under, your deposit is refunded to you 100%. And that is a security of ensuring and insisting that your deposit sits in the developer solicitor's trust account. Under no circumstance do I suggest or recommend at all or advise that you allow your deposit to be released. So then you'd say, okay, Pete, that's great, that's secure. So what about all these stories that we hear? I mean, people are losing their money to developers a lot. What's the story? The simple reason and the simple answer, guys, is people along the way agree for one reason or another to release that deposit to a developer. It could be ignorance and lack of knowledge or lack of understanding how risky it may be. It could be lack of advice and understanding what it means. But what I believe is the number one reason why people are still releasing money to a developer during the course of construction, it's got to do with what I call incentives, incentivized programs. I'll give you a perfect example. Someone's buying their first property off the plan for $500K. 10% deposit, $50,000. Developer comes and knocks on the door and says, okay, Mr. Smith, give me the $50,000 deposit. Let me use it for construction. And when I use that for construction, you allow me to do so, when settlement time comes, I'm going to give you $10,000 off the purchase price. Now, is that lucrative or not? 10 grand is 10 grand. And to someone who's about to buy their first off-the-plan acquisition, who has spent a lot of time saving that deposit, that $10,000 is very attractive. So they begin to justify in their mind releasing that deposit. It's an unconditional contract anyway, and more often than not, yes it is. I'm going to buy the property. If I release my funds, I'm saving myself $10,000. Wow, it's fantastic, it's great. The problem with that pattern of thinking is that if something happens to the developer, although legally you're entitled to get your $10,000 back, what do you think your practical chances are of getting $10,000 of a broke developer? even if he has other assets, where do you think you fit on the line of creditors and priority-wise to get your money back? Exactly right. Thank you very much. Right down the bottom. So security, yes, off the plan is secure. Off the plan is safe. And the professionals out there will advise you about all the benefits with off the plan. But from a legal perspective, if there's a question on your mind as to the security of your deposit, it's very simple. Ensure your deposit sits in trust. Ensure your deposit is not released to the developer under any circumstance, and you have nothing to worry about in that regard. So that is with regards to security and the safety of your deposit. Now, there are some other things with off the plan. It doesn't exist yet. That's why we say off the plan. You're in essence buying a promise to build. When you're buying off the plan, in simple English, you are buying a promise to build. Now, that promise, of course, is governed and protected by various laws that come and protect you as a consumer. But one of the biggest concerns that people have with off the plan is, what if what I have purchased is completely different to what I'm paying for at settlement? How am I protected for variations, for changes in various aspects of this acquisition? One thing you need to be mindful of is the law comes in to protect you in various components. And one thing I want to talk about is what I like to call the 5% rule. Generally, this rule is adopted in all states. Let's say you bought an 80-meter squared apartment on the 10th floor. The draft plan that you looked at the contract with your conveyancer shows it's 80 meters squared. You've examined that plan and you can see the design, the layout, the dimension, the specifications, everything's fine. Now that draft plan is pre-approved, or what's called the preliminary plan. The local council and relevant authorities have given the developer the right to market to you as a consumer and to sell to you that particular design and the size. When settlement time comes, your prudent conveyancer is going to get what's called a registered copy of that plan. And what they're going to simply do is compare both plans and identify whether there are any variations to the size, layout, dimension, and so on. Now, what if that 80 meter squared apartment on settlement is now 65 meters squared? How are you protected as a consumer against such a variation? This is where the 5% rule comes in. And very simply put, what the law today says, and what is generally accepted in most off-the-plan contracts, is if there is a variation to the size of your particular apartment that exceeds 5% of the total size of what you've acquired, you are legally entitled, should you wish to do so, walk away from the contract, recover 100% of your deposit, walk away. If there is a variation to the size of your apartment that is less than 5%, as it stands today, the law does not see that as detrimental to the overall value of what you've acquired. And we simply have to proceed. So our protection as a consumer against the potential variation is 5%. Now that's the law. Let's talk a bit more practically, because the law really bores me. Practical is a bit more excited. Why would a plan that's registered, or sorry, that's pre-approved by council today, why would it change tomorrow? I would expect that if council has done its due diligence and has given the green light for the developer to build in accordance with that plan, that I am expecting an 80 meter squared apartment on settlement. Now, there are some considerations. Let me paint you an example. You bought an apartment and there's a massive corridor, hallway in the building that you're in. And today's regulations under council state that the width of that corridor perhaps has to be 1.5 wide. Over the next few months, there's been some debate and there's been some approach to the council by local health authorities who have said to council, listen, over the years we've seen and we've realized 1.5 wide in the case of emergency, in the case of perhaps wheelchair access, perhaps in the case of ambulance beds getting in and out, not good enough, not wide enough. We want you to revisit regulations. And we want to perhaps change it to 1.8 wide. Now, if council adopts a variation to building standards, and if council decides to change that, and all of a sudden new standards come out, new regulations come out to state, from now on, corridors in apartments have to be 1.8 wide. That's an extra 0.3 on the corridor that's been pre-approved in your apartment. Now, the developer can't build or can't acquire any more land, I should say. So therefore, along the course of construction, the width of that corridor, guess what? It's going up by an extra 0.3. Where do you think that 0.3 is going to come from? There's going to be a variation to the apartments. So it is something that is logical. It is something that could happen. It is not extremely common, yet it's not something that never takes place. But you need to be aware again of how you are protected. So coming back to that security, the security of knowing that if there is a variation, the law does protect you with a limitation of 5% as it stands today. Now, another thing I want to mention to you, let's talk practically again. Let's say there's a variation in your apartment at 5.1%. automatically it entitles you to do what? You can pull out of the contract. Do you have to? No. It's a question. You may turn around and say, Pete, hold on a second. The property's gone up in value. I love the finished product. I'm getting great appraisals from agents that I'm going to get a good rental return. You may in fact turn around and say, you know what? I'm going to waive my right for to walk away as a result of the 5.1%. I still want to proceed. In fact, there's something else that you can potentially try and do. You can go back to the developer and knock on the door and say, Mr. Developer, you've caused a variation in the contract at 5.1%. I can walk away if I wish to do so. I'm choosing not to. What are you prepared to do for me? And so you can begin negotiating. Now, of course, that negotiation is going to strongly depend on the nature of the market at the time. You probably have guessed it. If the market is strong, if the market's gone up, if your property is appreciated in value, what do you think the developer's response is going to be? Definitely not. Well done. Definitely not. Because they're going to say, that's okay, exercise your right to walk away, here's your money, thank you very much, and they'll sell it to me for an extra 5–10%. That's usually what happens. But if the market's gone down, or if the market's going through some sort of correction, perhaps a potential variation may cause you some leverage to negotiate price or other incentives with a developer. Does that make sense, guys? Yeah? Okay. So that's variations. Now, please bear in mind what I'm mentioning to you guys today is simply a snippet of some of the key factors that you should consider when looking at off-the-plan acquisitions. By no means is this an in-depth, detailed presentation. This is just a touch of certain points that you should consider. I want to briefly talk about finishes, and I want to talk about the emotional part where a lot of the ladies, or perhaps some of the men, may want to know, hey, what appliances am I getting? All right, is it Fisher & Paykel? Is it Miele? Is it Bosch? What's coming in this property? Now, very simply, in every off-the-plan contract, because again you can't physically see the property, there has to be a schedule of inclusions or finishes attached to that contract to give you an idea of what you're getting, and generally speaking, a view of what the quality of that what that finish is. Now, let's say you go and you look at it and you say, oh, great, I'm getting a Fisher & Paykel dryer. Fantastic. Come settlement, and you find out it's no longer Fisher & Paykel. It's been varied. Now, it's been varied to Smeg, Bosch, Miele. Well, if it's Miele, you're not going to complain. But if it's varied to a different appliance, how are you protected in that regard? Very simple. The law simply states that if there's a variation in an appliance in the contract, it has to be of equal to or greater than value to what you as a consumer have been promised. Not by your standard, nor by his or their standard, being who, the developer, but by industry standard. And that ensures that you don't get an inferior product put in your apartment that perhaps is somewhat different to what was promised to you a year or 2 or 3 ago. And that's how the law protects you in that regard. You have every right to inspect and identify whether there is a variation, and if there's a question as to whether it's inferior, generally speaking, an arbitrator will determine that based on industry standard. In all the years that I've specialized in off-the-plan, very, very rarely have I had any problems with finishes in the property. Developers these days are pretty well versed and aware of what is expected of them, and are pretty well aware of the headache it's going to cause should they put an inferior product, take it out and put something that's suitable in there. So as far as finishes, something to think about. Finishes could change, appliances could change, but it's got to be equivalent or greater than value. And by the way, some of these changes come because of practical reasons. Developers not going to buy inclusions today for a property 3 years away from today. They're going to wait 4 to 6 months prior. They're going to go with a tender, and they're going to say, we need 5,000 dryers for our products. If Fisher & Paykel doesn't have it, they're not going to wait. Time is money. They're going to go to the nearest competitor. And these are some things that you need to consider. Defects, one of the big ones. Today, when you buy an existing property, you're able to physically walk in and have a look and see what is faulty, what needs work, what you can negotiate on, and what needs to be attended to. Do you have that with off-the-plan? No, not straight away. But does that mean your right to inspect and address and identify as defects is taken away from you? Far from it. Your right to inspect and identify defects with off-the-plan is simply postponed until such time that the property comes into existence. And the law allows you to go and inspect the property and identify defects. Now, I want to break down defects in a very, very simple way for you, and you're looking at basically major and minor defects. And that's the very simplest way of identifying defects today. The difference between a major and minor defect under law generally is as follows. A major defect is anything whatsoever that stops or prohibits your tenant, your income from that property, occupying the premises. Example, a major structural crack. But another example, a front door that doesn't secure. Now you can see a vast difference in the actual nature of those two defects, can't you? A structural crack is quite evident that it's by nature structural. But a front door that doesn't secure, perhaps under the building game, is not classified as a major defect. But under law, the effect of the front door of your home not securing, what is the effect? There's no security to who? Tenant, yeah? And if there's no security to the tenant, who misses out on rent? You. As a result, that's classified as a major defect. In other words, if there's anything that stops your tenant moving into the property and paying you a rental return, in other words, costing you money, detrimental to you financially, you don't have to settle. That is the law. You don't have to settle. It is the developer's responsibility to rectify that defect for you at their own cost, ensure the property is fit for habitat, fit for occupation, then you can proceed to settlement. That is generally the idea with regards to significant or major defects. Well, what about minor defects, cosmetic defects? Now these are defects in the property that perhaps do exist, but don't stop your tenant from occupying the premises. What are we talking about? Cement on windows that hasn't been cleaned, leaking showers, loose floorboards, minor sediment cracks internally, loose door handles internally to the property, anything of that nature. Now, what does the law say? Well, whose responsibility is it to rectify the defect with an off-the-plan acquisition? The developer. At whose cost? The developer. When? Not necessarily before settlement. And this is where a lot of people miss it. When you're buying off the plan, you have every right to identify all the defects, but cosmetic or minor defects can be rectified by a developer post-settlement or after settlement. So it's very important for us to identify when doing inspections what's major and what's not, what is required to be carried out before settlement, and what can be done after settlement. And the law doesn't just leave you at settlement. The law generally also gives you, with most contracts, a 3 months defects liability period after the settlement. That's very important, because a lot of time with a brand new property, when you go and have a look at it before settlement, everything looks very nice and dandy, it's just been finished. But when someone moves in there and starts using the shower and the bathroom and the kitchen and the appliances, and when the property starts to settle physically into the ground, perhaps then we'll be able to see a little bit more of what defects there are in the property. So in that regard, the law allows you a further 90 days after settlement to do further inspections. And you do those inspections, you get the list, you go to the developer, thank you very much, get it fixed. So the law has a lot of protection in place for you as a consumer with regards to defects. However, your representative and your conveyancer needs to make sure that you're well aware of how it operates and how it's done. Now, when it comes to inspections, how do we deal with inspections? Do you have a right to inspect your property? 100%. Should you? That's a personal choice. I'll tell you what I do, and I'll tell you what many other investors do, and you can decide. I do two things. I don't get involved emotionally with any property that I buy, but I'm a curious person, and I always will go to see what I buy. If it's in Queensland, if it's in Melbourne, if it's in WA. That's just me. Why? Not just do I want to see the finished product, but I want to see the area. I want to see where I've invested. I want to see where's the amenities, where's the transportation, where's the schools, where's the hospitals, what kind of infrastructure in the area. That's a lot of the time the reason why I like to go and inspect, and I want to see the finished product, perhaps if I consider investing with that developer again and again and again. But when it comes to defects, I have no clue, no idea whatsoever. So what do? I actually appoint an independent building company to go out and do what's called a defects report for me. I will pay them their $400, $500, $600. They will go and do a specific defects report. I will take that report, go back to the developer, say, thank you very much, please get these defects rectified. Now, you may perhaps be someone who's well versed in the building game. You may have family or friends that are builders or tradespeople, and you may say, Pete, not interested. I will just go myself and do the own inspection, which you can. Or you may say, I'll send my brother or my uncle or my cousin or my nephew, whoever it may be, to go and do that report because they're well versed in the game. You can also do that. Some people will say, I'm completely and utterly emotionally detached and I have no time in the world, not interested, send an inspector out, get him to have a look at it. I'm not going to go and have a look. Some clients simply don't have the time to go and have a look at their properties. Some are interstate or perhaps overseas, so they'll adopt a policy, we won't go and have a look, we're simply going to send an inspector out. My recommendation, my opinion, particularly if it's your first or second, make the effort, take the time, Jump on the plane if it's in another state, go and have a look at your property, familiarize yourself with the process, familiarize yourself with the area. Don't get emotionally attached, but go and have a look. And I also recommend, if you don't have knowledge in off the plan or perhaps in the building game, appoint a builder. Trust me, it's worth the $500. So guys, I hope this was just been a very brief and informative time for you to give you an idea of some things to consider. It's not really all that scary buying off the plan from a legal perspective. The law does protect you, but when you educate yourself and understand that as far as time, security, variations, finishes and defects, there are things in place to protect you as a consumer and make sure that it's a good experience that you continue to build on as you build your property portfolio. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.